Welcome to Strictly Facts, a guide to Caribbean history and culture, hosted by me, Alexandria Miller. Strictly Facts teaches the history, politics, and activism of the Caribbean and connects these themes to contemporary music and popular culture. Wantin' people, thanks for tuning in to another episode of Strictly Facts, the guide to Caribbean history and culture. Just a few episodes ago, we talked about activist and cultural ambassador Claudia Jones and how she founded Britain's first Caribbean carnival. Carnival takes place all over the world, in the Caribbean, outside of the Caribbean, also in parts of the Caribbean diaspora. But today we are talking about how Carnival got its start, as well as other Caribbean festivals. So joining us today is fellow Caribbean Cultural Studies sister and scholar, Shauna Rigaud. So Shauna, please introduce yourself. Tell us a bit about who you are, where in the Caribbean you rep, what you do, and all that stuff.
Yes. Hey, everybody. So glad to be here. Super excited for this conversation. My name is Shauna Rigaud. I am I guess now I'm a fifth year
Yay.
PhD candidate.
Yes.
The time has flown by. I'm a fifth year PhD candidate at George Mason University in cultural studies. My parents hail, my mom is from Barbados and my father is from Haiti. Growing up, I spent lots and lots of summers in Barbados. And that's actually where I'm at now as we have this conversation.
I'm very jealous.
Yes, the ocean is just not even a mile from me. Jesus. Just a slight 15-minute walk.
Just you over here having me depressed. But anyways,
Right.
tell us a bit more about what you do and how you got interested in this work.
Yeah. So it's actually really interesting how I even came to cultural studies too. So a lot of folks think that cultural studies is sort of like, whenever I was like, oh yeah, I'm a cultural studies student, and they're like, oh, what culture? And I'm like, not exactly. So cultural studies is really about the study of how everyday experiences, life, cultural products, right, are impacted by our social relations, power, economy, that kind of thing. And so I got into cultural studies because I thought that cultural studies was about different cultures. Surprise, surprise. But actually, I have a bachelor's degree in African American Studies at University of Massachusetts at Amherst. And then I did my master's in cultural gender studies at Simmons University. And I actually have a dual master's from there. So my second master's is in communications management. And I was not thinking about a PhD at all. I was actually thinking about just using my master's and going back into nonprofit work. But one of my thesis advisors was, telling me like, oh, like, have you ever thought about teaching? And I was like, no. And then another thesis advisor was like, have you ever thought about a PhD program? Because you can write. And I was like, no, I haven't thought about any of those things. I actually ended up teaching a class right after I finished my master's at Simmons and really enjoyed it. And so then I started thinking about sort of, well, if I got a PhD, like what would it be in? What would I want to do? And I really had to sit and think about like what were the kind of experiences and kind of stories that I'd like to tell. And so I started thinking about my own experience like growing up and my own experience being American but distinctly West Indian. And actually, there was also an experience that I had when I was about 15 years old, where this older gentleman in the community that I lived in, I'm also from Boston. I didn't say that either, but I'm from Boston. But this older gentleman sort of, and it's a much longer story, but I'll just give the snapshot. But he basically was telling me, after learning that my parents were from the West Indies, he basically was telling me like, well, West Indian people needed to bow down to Black Americans because, they've basically paved the way for us to be here. And at 15, I didn't have the language, right, to be able to tell this man something different, right? But I knew that there was something strange about that statement and in a variety of different ways. And as I had grown up, from, and learning about Black history, learning about more about Caribbean history, I really started to understand the kind of linkages that were part of these communities, right? That Black folks in the U.S. Have always been in community with West Indians, right? And Africans, and so I wanted to be able to think about sort of how these linkages continue, right? What are the things about our communities that are important for our solidarity, right, as Black folks? And so that's where I came to my PhD program. I was like, oh, I'm really interested in sort of these larger questions about power and relationships and solidarity and how culture is engaged in those things. And so my dissertation is actually looking at Barbados and the history of the Crop Over Festival and sort of what the Crop Over Festival's role is in terms of culture and economy and the ways in which the Crop Over Festival reflects, right, a Barbadian national identity. So that's what I've been doing and how I got here. I think.
No, thank you. So I was like, okay, wait, spin-off questions. But I mean, one thing I think you beautifully said is that there is such a large history of the linkages across the African diaspora, especially
Right.
when you're thinking of like places in the
Right.
global north, like the UK, like the US, etc. That I mean, if we go down a path about like Black history in public schools, that will lead us down a very different conversation. Um, but I
Yeah.
mean, I think there's
Yeah.
a
Yeah.
longer history that what better way to study those linkages than the ways that we come together, especially through culture. So before we dive directly into crop over, when we think of Caribbean festivals and celebrations, we definitely think carnival, and we don't necessarily consider that there are
Yeah.
not everybody has carnival, and
Yeah.
or at least in the same way, and the different origin stories between the two. So firstly, starting with carnival, when I think of carnival, I immediately think of freedom and emancipation, right? Though
Mhm.
it didn't originally start that way. So like Mardi Gras in the US, carnival's history in the Caribbean has obvious connections to Catholicism and its introductions to the region through slavery, especially during the 18th century. But even before the celebrations that we know of as today as Carnival, there were the Canboulay harvest parades in which enslaved Africans gathered to put out sugarcane fires, and they celebrated and sang and danced, etc. So could you talk to us a bit about how Carnival begins to evolve from what we know it as today, stemming from those Canboulay festivals?
Like you said, when folks think about sort of carnival and the history of carnival in the West Indies, right? Right, we're looking at Trinidad, right? And being the greatest show on earth. And like you said, there's this sort of piece around carnival's history really comes from colonialism, right? And what the key thing for folks to remember or think about, right, is that it's always sort of this struggle, right, for power in terms of how carnival sort of evolves itself, right? You talked about it being coming from these sort of Lenten celebrations. And when Trinidad was colonized by the Spanish actually gave some land away to French planters, right, to bring them in because they weren't really using that space. And so what the French did was bring in their tradition of carnival. And so it's this tradition that goes back to the Middle Ages of really like flipping the world upside down, right? Folks who are poor can pretend that they're rich, right? You pretend that there's sort of this abundancy, right? And this is sort of you have these massive feasts and celebrations, right? Because in essence, right, that's not actually what's happening, right? And so there's kind of this sort of masking of the world in that way. And so when the French are doing it, the enslaved Africans, right, see that and they start doing their own types of sort of play on these things. And there then becomes, as the British, right, come in, right, to take over the island, right, then they start to demand that the slaves no longer participate in these things. So they start restricting them, right? And that's when you get the Canboulay riots and them sort of coming in to demand those pieces of what they see as part of sort of the thing that they do. And the Canboulay riots are shortly after emancipation too in the West Indies, right? And so again, this kind of constant fight for power and negotiation of power is what's happening in the Caribbean with Carnival. And so as part of sort of how culture is always evolving, right? Then sort of these traditions become something that folks start to replicate and do over. And it's interesting too, because the carnival itself has had different types of reforms over the years, right? Where people in power wanted to try to, again, limit the freedoms of folks who are participating in these things, right? So the wealthy class see what sort of the more impoverished Afro Trinidadians are doing and want to sort of like suspend them. So they start to do rules about Carnival and what you can do at Carnival and how you should dress at Carnival. So it's really interesting to see some of these old flyers and pamphlets, right? Talking about like, you shouldn't be too drunk and you have to be covered at all times. And we're like, oh, they were saying that back in the early 1900s, right? But it's also interesting to see how Carnival has sort of evolved in that way, because then it becomes part of a civilizing mission, right? They're trying to pull the lower class into what could be seen as respectable carnival, right, presentations. So that's when they start to develop winning prizes as part of the competition, right? A prize for your costume, a prize for your band. And so you start to see these ways of sort of kind of disciplining the masses into participating in a particular type of festival. So it's interesting because Carnival itself has sort of done this kind of evolving. Carnival in Trinidad has become part of the culture in the country. And part of that means, particularly after independence, seeking out ways to make the festival sort of part of a tourist product, right? And so you'll have more Trinidadians participating in Carnival, but now, right, as sort of the 1950s and 60s, we saw more air travel. Now you have people, then you have sort of folks that are living off the island that are Trinidadian sort of coming back for Carnival, or that's the time to come home. Or you see now that we're in the age of social media, right? You see folks sort of marking out space to participate in Carnival, right? Because they want to, post the videos, be in that costumes. And so it sort of transformed into a tourist attraction as well. And I think that that's sort of where all of the Caribbean, I won't say all, but where a number of Caribbean nations have sort of realized that this type of festival, right, can become something that they can benefit from, right? So in the last few years, we've seen an uptake in Carnival in Jamaica, right? You've seen sort of St. Lucia and St. Vincent sort of being more cognizant about sort of pushing their carnivals as part of a tourist market, because now you can not only participate in Trinidad Carnival, but if you want to do these other, if you want to continue to do that, there's now a whole calendar of carnivals that you can participate in, right? That leads you through the whole year. Not only the ones on the islands, but also thinking about the ones in the diaspora, right? So those are also part of this this carnival, right, calendar that folks can participate in. And I feel like there might be I can keep going, but I don't know if you want me to stop there.
You answered at least probably 3 of my questions already through that. So no, you did beautifully. But I mean, I do want to take us back to the Canboulay riots briefly, because I think, especially as you said, in this age of social media and things, people think of Caribbean Carnival as, glitz and glam and the costumes and, wanting to post the video and the pictures on Instagram, which I have done. So, like, I'm not shading it. I just think, like, especially, maybe for those who are not within our communities, right? There is a dearth of knowledge regarding that deeper history. And so bringing us back to the Canboulay riots for a
Mhm.
moment. So this is 1881, as you said, after emancipation. What exactly did the riots look like? You know, I think oftentimes revolts and revolutions get pinned in a certain way, but I think the Canboulay riots, in a sense, are really special because it's both a moment of protest, but also, you know, in the midst of what was going to be their cultural celebration.
Mhm. 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 Yeah, yeah, yeah. So the Canboulay riots, right, like you mentioned, are a very significant part of sort of the Trinidad Carnival tradition. So I think the piece, right, that's critical about that is again, this is a call to action because of continued repression, right? This piece around power. And Trinidad again has a really interesting history because they've had several different colonizing powers that have come in, create, right, that power over the country, right, that are colonizing the country. And so you start with the Spanish, and then you go to the French, and then you go to the British, and then back to the French. And so again, there's a constant sort of mashup of culture there. And so what the Canboulay riots sort of shows us is how, because it really starts with the banning of the drums, right? That the British did not want African slaves to do. And so, of course, like all folks who are as resilient as Black people, we say, okay, you don't want us using drums, all right, we're going to use these bamboo sticks, right? And so then they sort of move into the bamboo sticks, and then they actually want to restrict them from participating in these carnival festivals. And that's where you have the burning of the canes, or the canboulay, right? Is this sort of fight against this kind of restriction that is happening within sort of the powers that be. And so I think that, one of the things that you mentioned, right, that folks are not always thinking of, just because the way that our carnivals are marketed is that we're not thinking about this kind of history, right? Right now, the way that carnivals are marketed, you're not thinking about sort of the labor of enslaved Africans. You're not thinking of the kind of resistance that enslaved Africans and Blacks had to do, right, on the island. So there's all this kind of resistance activities, and that's really where the Canboulay riots come from. So Blacks on the island have been participating in this festival. This is part of their culture because they're getting it from, at this point, a number of decades of sort of following sort of these French traditions with an African expression too, right? So they are now seeing it as part of their particular culture. They're seeing it as part of the thing that they annually do. And so when the British wanted to come in and sort of stop that, folks were like, absolutely not. Absolutely not. You cannot end this particular tradition that we've been doing for so long. So again, so it was really about this like clash of this culture, right? This culture that had been present, right? And then you have a colonial power trying to squash that because of the kind of ways that British respectability, I guess, sort of does to us, is that who wants these Black people dancing and carrying on in the street? Like for British folks, like they're like, what is this? Even what they could see, or what could be seen as, right, sort of the French tradition of masquerade as a part of this, like they're like, what is this, right? So British people are very different culturally, and so there was no way that they were going to then allow this to happen. And so I know that in the Canboulay riots, right, there were attacks on police stations, right, in addition to the burning of cane fields, right, again, in a moment of resistance, right? We're not going to allow you to take away this particular thing that's important to us. I feel like I said a lot.
No, you did. You did, but it was all great. No, thank you. And then in sort of adding to this continuation of this history, right? Beyond what we maybe think of as the most of the costumes that you'll probably see on Instagram, there are also a host of other costumes, right, that are replicating or that are honoring our histories of resistance, right? And so, whether it's the Moko Jumbi, like literally, I will add in the Strictly Facts syllabus a list to various characters because we could go on and on, but like beyond that sort of marketability, right, of what you probably will see on the Instagram or on the tourist board website, the true origin points of that resistance have definitely continued and remained, even though it may not be something that we so openly see all the time.
Right. And in carnival, right, there's this tradition of old mass and pretty mass, right? Pretty mass is what really gets marketed, right? That's the beads and
Mm-hmm.
bikini mass. And old mass is where you'll find more of the traditional characters or the traditional way of doing mass, right? Because people did not have, feathers to design or even funds to do that. What you did, right, back in the early years of carnival is that you fashion fabric together. You fashion these things together from old pieces of garments or linens or borrowed things from other people to create, right, your costume that you would have. And so old mass is where you find more of that traditional mass, right? This sort of like collecting of pieces, right, to create this new mask for yourself. Or you'll find those more traditional folk characters, right? Like the Dam Laram, like you said, the Moko Jumbis, right? And then you have this tradition of Jab, right? The Blue Devils, right? Also as part of it, right? Paint and oil, right, is also part of an old mass tradition as well.
So we say this to say, everybody, we fully embrace the celebration of
Yeah.
Carnival. It's just we really want to ensure that everybody knows that there's this deeper history behind
Mhm.
it. It's not just pretty math. But now I do
Mhm.
want to shift a bit to talking about crop over. So shout out to Rihanna, gotta do props to Rihanna. But I remember a few years ago when Rihanna attends crop over, obviously the pictures are on social media, and just because it's Rihanna, it's Caribbean, it's the costume, right? So I had a lot of people being like, "Oh yeah, Alex, Rihanna's at Carnival, da da da," and I was like, I mean, sort of, but not technically, right? And so Crop Over is an example of another Caribbean festival, but I want to allow you to talk us a bit through this history because it's so under discussed.
Yes, yes. So a Bajan will tell you Crop Over is not a carnival. Crop Over is the sweetest summer festival. It's a distinction, right, that needs to be made because of some of the history, right? But because of the globalization and commodification of carnival, Crop Over falls into right, these carnival traditions, right? And for folks that don't know, sort of carnival and festival, right, become work hand in hand. But crop over is distinctly different in that it's not a Lenten carnival. So it doesn't follow those Lenten traditions of sort of, giving up of the flesh that happens. It doesn't happen, in Lenten times. Crop over, actually, its origins come from a harvest festival that used to happen at plantations around Barbados. And the Harvest Festival was formerly known as Harvest Home. And that was the name that was given to it because it comes from an English harvest festival of the same name. And so I'll do the short. I feel like I'll do the short version without giving too much information. So we know that like sort of harvest festivals are part of an agrarian society, right? From centuries ago, right? Folks who depended on the land would oftentimes have these celebrations to be able to give thanks to the creator, a creator, many creators, right, for being able to have a good harvest. And so the Harvest Home Festival that was happening in Barbados, the first way that we find out or see Harvest Home or this kind of celebration in Barbados is happening around the 1790s. the planters would do is that at the end of a harvest, what they would do is they would have drinks and food for their enslaved population, and they would then celebrate at the end of the harvest. And that celebration would consist of bringing out the last canes, harvesting the last canes and bringing them all out on these decorated carts. Also, as part of sort of those early celebrations, they would have a member of the enslaved community sort of giving thanks to their hosts, the planters, the plantation owners, and then they would take part in dancing. The other interesting tradition that they would have for, again, in Barbados, is that they have the burning of an effigy called Mr. Harding. And it would basically symbol, right, that the harvest time, or rather the end of a harvest, was a very hard time for folks who were enslaved. And then even thinking about after emancipation, the blacks on the island that lived in poverty, because once the harvest is over, there's very little work. If there's very little work, there's very little money, and that means there's very little food. And so that burning of the effigy, Mr. Harding, really symbolized hoping and praying for a very short, what they would call hard time. And so that's where those celebrations, celebrations again sort of start around 1790 is when we see in the archives the earliest mention of something like that, and then continue on until probably about the 1940s or so. But by that time, Barbados's sort of impact on the world in terms of the sugar cane crop is sort of dwindling. By the 1940s, there's sugar grown, right, in other places that are much bigger. Beet sugar is also something that started to be heavily produced, so folks could find sugar in other, right, vegetables, which started to bring down the price of cane sugar, right, which then meant something very very devastating for Barbados, right, where sugarcane is their main export. So if the price of sugar is low, there's not going to be much money flowing into that colony. And so by the 1920s, where Barbados was originally seen as one of the most lucrative colonies for Britain, by the 1920s, it started to decline, right? Jamaica's making more sugar. You have beet sugar. You have sugar in Cuba, right? So bigger islands are taking up that share of the market. And so you have the celebrations of this sort of crop over or the harvest home celebrations are kind of dwindling by the 1940s, sort of as they did in sort of its heyday. Many folks felt like that the harvest home festival had sort of died around the 1940s. But there's work by Dr. Marcia Burrows out of the University of West Indies, Cave Hill. She's done a lot of work on collecting oral histories and on the history of crop over that finds that even though there weren't as many harvest home celebrations in plantations, what you had is that in sort of smaller villages, folks were still doing these kinds of celebrations. So when the tourist board revives the Crop Over Festival, they understand that it's not only a way to bring in visitors, right? But it's also a way to try to potentially showcase Barbadian culture. And so they've really tried to pull in some of the pieces of that sort of original harvest home celebration. Originally, the Crop Over Festival had a decorated donkey cart, which people would say is like specifically Bajan, right? So they would have that decorated donkey cart parade. They would have different sort of craft fairs. They would have dances and calypso competitions. And as the festival started to develop, they did start to bring in elements of Trinidad's carnival as well, right? So that's when you sort of what we have as our day of mass is Kadooment Day, right? Kadooment being a Bajan word, but it has those Trini elements of masquerading. on top of that. And so the festival sort of evolves into this festival of Bajan identity and culture. We have something here called Bridgetown Market that is also sort of the Saturday and Sunday before Kadooment Day. The other really important thing that people don't realize is that Crop Over is not sort of just like that last week when everybody comes in. Crop Over is essentially an 8-week celebration. So prior to the week before Kadooment Day, there are all kinds of events that people participate in here on the island, including sort of parties and fetes, but also cultural things. So we have calypso tents, we have our soca competitions as well. So there are all of these other things that sort of reinforce, right, these ideas of Barbadian culture.
And so in that, right, you are very much so a part of shepherding and continuing the traditions of Crop Over through your organization Mayhem 246. Could you tell us a bit about Mayhem 246, why you created it, and what it means for
Mm-hmm.
you to be participating not only as a scholar of Caribbean history and culture, but as a person from there, who wants to ensure that these traditions are kept alive in the most
Mm-hmm.
sort of authentic ways.
Yeah. So Mayhem 246 is a concierge company that I started with my good friend and sorority sister who lives on the island. And like I said, I have been coming to Crop Over since I was a baby. And it's only until I found money as an adult that I started really jumping, because here is not for Crop Over. You don't play mass, you jump for Kadooment Day. So I started jumping in Crop Over, and as I started having more friends who participated in other carnivals, they would be like, oh, I really want to go to Crop Over. They would ask me about what they were doing, and then I'd be like, oh yeah, this is great. And it was sort of a list of events that were foreign events, right? So events from New York promoters or Trinidad promoters, right, on the island. I'd be like, okay, this is nice. But if you're coming to Barbados, you should be at Bajan events. You should be at things that is going to showcase Bajan soca, because it's a very distinct sound, Bajan soca, as is the accent, right? You should potentially be going to some cultural events, participating in some things on the island. And so that's really where Mayhem 246 came about, is that, I think it was in 2016, I had like a group of friends. It was like 15 of them. And they was like, Shauna, we trying to come to Crop Over. Like, what are you doing? And I was like, all right. So I put together an itinerary. I was like, I'll figure out taxis. I work with my friends. We had taxis shuttling people, blah, blah, blah. I got back from Crop Over that year, and I was like, I should just do this, because people want the experience, and they want to be able to sort of, if they haven't been here before, want to be able to like figure out how to participate in this festival without a lot of stress. And so that's really what May 46 is doing. It's like, come and enjoy your Crop Over. We will take care of your costumes, your fetes. If you're interested in liming on the beach or doing some tourist things, here are some things that we can, arrange for you. And you'll get to leave Barbados singing Bajan tunes, right? So that's really what we wanted to do. And it's really a passion project of mine, because I love Crop Over as much as I do. I really want folks to understand the history of the festival and understand like what makes Barbadian culture different from another island that you might go to. So to really showcase the beauty that is Barbados and that is the Crop Over Festival.
So all that to say, y'all, when the world opens up again, when Crop Over reignites, who are we hitting up?
Yes.
Shauna and Mayhem
Yes.
246.
Yes. You can find us on the socials, Mayhem 246 on Instagram. Our website is mayhem246.com. Definitely hit us up if you're interested in going to Crop Over.
Yes, beautifully said. Well, our Strictly Facts big question in my head, given this history of carnival and of crop over, what are some of your favorite examples of Caribbean pop culture, Caribbean music, Caribbean films, etc., that have to do with carnival and crop over?
Yeah. So I love this question. I really had to think hard, and I feel like I didn't think hard enough, but I did want to. I'm like, I need some more time. I need more time. But I'm a soca lover. So the first thing that came to me was like, what are the songs that I really love during Carnival? And so because we're talking about Crop Over, I have to also put some Bajan artists in there. So I wanted to highlight Sanctuary and his song Pick Me Up. So I think that was 2000 and I think that was Crop Over 2017. And the song is basically like, I'm in a fete, like I might be drunk, but I'm gonna always have somebody, I'm gonna have my friend around to pick me up, right? And it was either 2017 or 2018 that song came out. I want to say 17, but that Crop Over, when I tell you that it rained, it rained, it rained. And again, right, this is again the beautiful thing about Crop Over and when Crop Over is, it's the end of the harvest season, which means it's also the rainy season in the island. So you will never have, people pray for a dry Kaduma Day, but it's always going to rain on Kaduma Day. But when I tell you that year, it rained so much so by the third fete, I was in my Juve boots at every event because the sun wasn't out enough for the rainfall to dry from the following night. So I was just like, I'm just wearing my Juve boots to every event. But my first night in, we went to Fete Walk, and which is like one of the big events that happens on the Wednesday night of that week leading into Kaduma Day. So we went to Fete Walk, and I had on my favorite sandals. I was in this cute outfit, and the rain came down. And when I tell you there was about 4 inches of mud, but I was still partying in 4 inches of mud. By the end of the fete, the mud was so deep that it popped my sandals. And so I was now walking to the taxi barefoot. And again, it was the year that Sanctuary song came out. And so we was just there, and then some random man picked me up and walked me out of the event so that I didn't have to walk in the mud in bare feet. But I think about that event. But again, it's that kind of, it's the community that you create at Carnival. And so I really love that song for that. And I feel like that song didn't get as much play outside of Barbados, right? Everybody needs to hear that song. It is one of the greatest songs ever, I think. Also want to highlight TC, who's a Bajan soca artist. Her Paradise, I think, is a lovely expression of sort of who Barbados is. And so I love that song as well. And then the last thing that I wanted to highlight is a book by Earl Lovelace called The Dragon Can't Dance. And so if you all have time, read that book. It's a beautiful book written about Trinidad Carnival that I think everyone would enjoy.
Oyago. Stay tuned for Strictly Facts Sounds, where we connect our history to pop culture. Shauna covered us on all things music for this Strictly Facts Sounds segment. So as she mentioned, be sure to check out Bajan soca artist Sanctuary and his 2018 song Pick Me Up and TC's 2017 song Paradise, as well as Trinidadian author Earl Lovelace's 1979 novel The Dragon Can't Dance, which is about a man's journey recreating a carnival costume in Port of Spain. Also, feel free to check out Haitian-born novelist and writer Edwidge Dandicat's 2002 After the Dance, a walk through Carnival in Jacmel, Haiti, which is her own personal reflections on Carnival's history and practices in Haiti. And lastly, one of my favorites, be sure to check out Trinidadian American Dr. Kevin Adonis Brown's 2018 book, High Mass, Carnival, and the Poetics of Caribbean Culture, which combines photography, criticism, and personal reflections of Trinidad's carnival. Shauna, thank you so much for coming on Strictly Facts to talk about all things carnival and crop over. We are so grateful to have you on the podcast, for speaking with me this episode. Do let everybody know where they can find you on social media, and also give Mayhem 246 another shout out.
Yes. You can find me. I am on Twitter and Instagram at NE1Nappy. It's NE, the number 1, NAPPY. You can find Mayhem 246 on Instagram at Mayhem 246, and then also on the web at mayhem246.com.
Perfect. Well, thank you for joining us again. Listeners, thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed the episode. Again, check out the Strictly Facts syllabus for all the links to all the references, the books, the songs, of course, that we talked about in this episode. And we hope you enjoyed. So, little more. Thanks for tuning in to Strictly Facts. Visit strictlyfactspodcast.com for more information from each episode. Follow us at Strictly Facts Pod on Instagram and Facebook, and at Strictly Facts PD on Twitter.